The avoidant is not necessarily aware of this pattern in a conscious, analytical way, but they are deeply conditioned by it. They come to expect your effort. They rely on your emotional availability as a kind of safety net. No matter how distant they become, there you are, trying to bridge the gap. And because of that, they never truly have to confront the impact of their behavior. But the moment you choose silence, real silence, not passive-aggressive silence, not silence filled with hidden expectation, but grounded, self-respecting silence, you break the entire structure of that pattern. Suddenly, something unfamiliar happens. The chase disappears. And when the chase disappears, the avoidant loses the role they've unconsciously mastered. They are no longer being pursued, no longer being convinced, no longer being emotionally carried. And that absence creates something they are not used to experiencing: space. Now, most people are afraid of space because they associate it with loss. But psychologically, space is where awareness begins. When there is no noise, no pressure, no constant reassurance, the mind has no choice but to turn inward. And for the avoidant, this is deeply uncomfortable because inward is exactly where they've spent their life trying not to go. Your silence removes the distraction. It removes the emotional buffer that allowed them to avoid themselves. And in that quiet, something subtle but powerful starts to happen. They begin to feel the absence, not just of you, but of what you represented. The consistency, the effort, the emotional presence. And without you actively reminding them of your value, they are forced to recognize it on their own. That's the shift, because as long as you were speaking, explaining, trying to be understood, you were in a way carrying the awareness for both of you. But silence transfers that responsibility back to them. It says, without words, I will no longer do the emotional labor that you are unwilling to do for yourself. And that's not punishment, that's clarity. Now, will every avoidant respond with immediate insight and transformation? No. Some will resist it. Some will distract themselves. Some will double down on their avoidance. But even in resistance, the pattern has been disrupted. The familiar rhythm is gone. And once a pattern is broken, it can no longer operate in the same unconscious way. So whether they admit it or not, something has shifted. Because for the first time, they are not reacting to you. They are left with themselves. And that is where every real change begins. When the pursuit ends, the truth begins. And once that silence settles in, once the noise of pursuit is gone, something even more profound begins to take shape. Your absence doesn't just create space, it becomes a mirror. You see, when you were present in the dynamic, you were not just a partner, you were also a buffer. Every time they pulled away, you filled the gap. Every time they became distant, you explained it away, softened it, rationalized it. You absorbed the emotional impact of their behavior and translated it into something more tolerable. And in doing so, you unintentionally protected them from seeing themselves clearly. But now, without your constant presence, there is nothing left to filter their actions. No one is there to reinterpret their silence as they just need space. No one is there to justify their inconsistency as they're just overwhelmed. No one is there to keep the emotional connection alive while they remain passive. And that's when the mirror appears, because in your absence, their behavior doesn't disappear. It echoes. It lingers. It becomes more visible precisely because there is no longer a response to dilute it. The distance they created is no longer balanced by your closeness. The effort they withheld is no longer compensated by yours. What's left is a raw, unedited version of their patterns, and that can be deeply unsettling, not because avoidants lack intelligence or awareness, but because they've spent a lifetime mastering the art of emotional deflection. They know how to stay busy, how to intellectualize, how to shift focus outward, but a mirror doesn't argue. It doesn't chase, it doesn't explain, it simply reflects. And reflection is powerful because it removes the possibility of distortion. When there is no external narrative to lean on, the internal one becomes louder. Questions begin to surface, sometimes subtly, sometimes all at once. Why did I pull away? Why did I feel the need to create distance? Why does this silence feel heavier than I expected? These are not comfortable questions, but they are necessary ones. Because for perhaps the first time, they are not analyzing you. They are confronting themselves. And this is where the psychological shift deepens. Awareness doesn't come from being told what you did wrong. It comes from seeing it without interference. From recognizing patterns not as isolated incidents, but as consistent behaviors that shape outcomes. And your silence creates the exact conditions for that recognition to emerge. Now, it's important to understand, this mirror doesn't force change, it invites it. Some will look away, some will avoid the reflection just as they've avoided emotions, but even then, the image has already been seen, and once seen, it cannot be completely unseen. There will always be a part of them that knows how they showed up, knows what they withheld, knows the role they played in losing something real, and that knowing, even if quiet, begins to erode the old narrative they once believed. That distance keeps them safe, that detachment has no cost, that they can engage without consequence. Because now the consequence is undeniable, not through confrontation, not through conflict, but through absence. And that's what makes your silence so powerful. It doesn't attack, it reveals. It doesn't accuse, it exposes. It allows them to meet themselves without interference, without distraction, without escape. And in that meeting, something shifts, whether immediately or over time. Because the moment someone truly sees their pattern, they can never go back to complete unconsciousness. And that is the beginning of transformation. When there is no one left to hide behind, the truth has nowhere else to go but inward. And as that mirror holds steady, unfiltered, uncompromising, something else begins to rise to the surface. Not clarity at first, not insight, but discomfort. Real, undeniable emotional discomfort. Because when you remove the Pravichnyi defenses, when you take away the constant motion of distraction and the Pravichka of emotional distance, what's left is feeling. And for the avoidant, feeling is precisely what they've spent years learning to manage, minimize, or escape altogether. Understand this clearly. Avoidance is not the absence of emotion. It is the suppression of it. It is the strategic redirection of emotional energy into safer territories. Logic, independence, control, detachment. So on the outside, it may appear as calm, composure, even indifference. But internally, there is often a quiet undercurrent of unresolved tension. And your silence disrupts the system that kept that tension contained. Because now there is no interaction to regulate the emotional flow, no conversation to steer things back into comfort, no reassurance to stabilize the distance. What emerges instead is a kind of psychological friction, confusion, restlessness, curiosity, sometimes even anxiety. And here's the paradox. This discomfort, the very thing they've been avoiding, is also the doorway to awareness. You see, most people believe growth comes from clarity first. Once I understand, then I'll change. But psychologically, it rarely works that way. Change is usually initiated by discomfort, by something that doesn't feel right, doesn't sit right, doesn't resolve itself through Pravichnyi patterns. Your silence creates that unresolved state. It introduces a question mark where there used to be a predictable cycle, and the human mind does not like unanswered questions. It seeks closure, explanation, meaning. So even if the avoidant initially tries to ignore it, the feeling lingers. It returns in quiet moments. It surfaces when distractions fade. It becomes harder to push away completely. Why does this feel different? Why isn't this situation resolving the way it used to? Why am I thinking about this more than I expected? These questions are subtle, but they signal something important. Attention is shifting inward, and once attention turns inward, even briefly, the possibility of awareness expands. Now, this stage is delicate, because discomfort can lead in two directions. It can either trigger deeper avoidance, more distraction, more emotional shutdown, or it can initiate reflection. And what determines that direction is not force, not pressure, but space. space to feel without being overwhelmed, space to think without being influenced, space to experience the consequence without immediate relief. That's what your silence provides. It doesn't rush them toward a conclusion. It doesn't demand an answer. It simply holds the tension long enough for something real to emerge. And in that tension, patterns begin to connect, not through external explanation, but through internal realization. They start to see that the discomfort they're feeling now is not random. It's linked to their own behavior, the distance they created, the connection they didn't nurture, the presence they took for granted. And that recognition, even if it's quiet, even if it's incomplete, is a breakthrough. Because for someone who has spent a lifetime avoiding emotional intensity, to sit with discomfort without immediately escaping it, that in itself is growth. It's the beginning of emotional capacity. It's the moment where avoidance starts to lose its grip, not because it's been challenged externally, but because it's no longer fully effective internally. And that's when something shifts at a deeper level. Because once a person realizes that avoiding emotion doesn't eliminate it, it only delays and intensifies it, they begin to question the very strategy they've relied on for so long. And that question is powerful because it opens the door to a new possibility, that facing discomfort might actually be safer than running from it. And when that idea takes hold, even slightly, the foundation of avoidance begins to crack. Growth doesn't begin with comfort. It begins the moment discomfort is no longer escaped, but examined. And as that discomfort lingers, no longer avoided, no longer fully suppressed, it begins to organize itself into something even more significant: understanding. Not abstract understanding, not intellectual justification, but a grounded realization that actions carry consequences. Because for a long time, the avoidant has operated within a kind of emotional insulation. Their distance didn't seem to cost them anything. Their withdrawal didn't immediately result in loss. Why? Because you were there, bridging the gap, keeping the connection alive, absorbing the inconsistency. In many ways, you softened the consequences of their behavior. So the equation never fully formed. They could pull away and still have access to you. They could remain inconsistent and still feel chosen. They could avoid depth without losing connection entirely. But now, with your silence, that equation changes. For the first time, there is a clear, undeniable link between what they did and what is happening now. The absence they feel is no longer abstract. It's specific. It's connected. It has a source. And this is where a deeper level of awareness begins to take hold, because the human mind is wired to look for cause and effect. When something meaningful is lost, the psyche naturally starts tracing it back. What led to this? Where did this shift begin? What role did I play? These questions mark a critical transition from passive experience to active reflection. And this is not about blame. It's about ownership, because there is a profound difference between feeling like something ended and recognizing how your own patterns contributed to that ending. One keeps you in a victim mindset. The other puts you in a position of power, because if your actions helped create the outcome, then different actions can create a different future. But that realization is not comfortable. In fact, it can be one of the most confronting moments in a person's emotional life. To see clearly that something meaningful was not lost randomly, not taken unfairly, but gradually pushed away through inaction, distance, or avoidance. That requires a level of honesty most people spend years avoiding. And yet, your silence makes that honesty possible, because you're no longer there to interrupt the process, no longer there to reassure them out of their discomfort, no longer there to offer a version of events that protects them from themselves. What remains is a direct experience of consequence, and consequence is a powerful teacher. Not because it punishes, but because it clarifies. It draws a straight line between behavior and outcome. It removes ambiguity. It answers the question that words often cannot. Does this way of being actually work? For the avoidant, that answer begins to shift. They start to see that emotional distance doesn't preserve connection. It erodes it. That withholding doesn't create safety. It creates separation. That independence, when taken to an extreme, doesn't lead to freedom. It leads to isolation. And these are not ideas imposed from the outside. They are conclusions drawn from lived experience. That's what makes them stick. Now again, not everyone will immediately act on this awareness. Some will resist it. Some will try to minimize it, rationalize it, or delay responding to it. But the link has been made. The pattern has been exposed in a way that can no longer be completely ignored. They know on some level that what they lost is connected to how they showed up, and that knowing changes the internal landscape, because once a person begins to associate their patterns with real consequences, those patterns lose their innocence. They are no longer unconscious habits. They become choices, and with that comes responsibility. And responsibility is the birthplace of change, because you cannot change what you refuse to own. But the moment you see your role clearly, even if it's uncomfortable, even if it challenges your identity, you step into a different level of awareness, one where growth is no longer theoretical, it becomes necessary. And that is the shift your silence creates. It turns vague disconnection into clear cause and effect. It transforms emotional distance into something measurable, something real, something undeniable. And in that clarity, a new truth emerges. What you do repeatedly doesn't just define your patterns, it determines what you get to keep. And as that clarity begins to settle, this recognition that actions have consequences, something else shifts beneath the surface, not just within them, but within the dynamic itself. The balance of control begins to change, because every relationship, whether acknowledged or not, operates within a structure of emotional power. Not power in the sense of dominance or manipulation, but in terms of who is reacting and who is choosing, who is anchored and who is adjusting. And in an avoidant dynamic, that balance often tilts in a very specific direction. The avoidant maintains control by creating distance. They decide when to engage, how much to reveal, how close things get. And the more the other person adapts, reaches out, waits, overextends, the more that control is reinforced. Not intentionally, not always consciously, but consistently. One person becomes the regulator of connection, the other becomes the responder. And over time, that imbalance becomes normalized. You start to measure your words, your timing, your expectations. You become hyper-aware of their shifts, their moods, their availability. And without realizing it, your emotional state becomes tied to their level of presence. When they lean in, you feel relief. When they pull away, you feel uncertainty. That's not connection. That's dependency shaped by inconsistency. But the moment you choose silence, intentional, grounded, self-directed silence, you step out of that reactive role. You stop adjusting. You stop chasing clarity from someone who withholds it. You stop negotiating your needs to maintain a connection that lacks reciprocity. And in doing so, you reclaim something essential, your center. Now, this is where the shift becomes undeniable. Because when you are no longer reacting, the avoidant no longer has the same structure to operate within. The dynamic they were accustomed to, the push and pull, the distance followed by your pursuit, is no longer available. And that creates instability for them. Not because you've done anything to them, but because the familiar pattern that gave them a sense of control has been removed. They can no longer predict your response. They can no longer rely on your presence as a constant, regardless of their behavior. And unpredictability challenges control. For the first time, they may begin to feel what you once felt: uncertainty, curiosity, even a lack of grounding. Why aren't they reaching out? Why does it feel different this time? Have I lost access to something I assumed would always be there? These questions are not just about you. They are about the loss of control over the dynamic. And this is where many people misunderstand the purpose of silence. It's not a strategy to make someone chase you. It's not a tactic to gain leverage. It's a realignment with your own values, a decision to no longer participate in a pattern that diminishes your sense of self. But as a byproduct of that realignment, the entire structure changes because control no longer sits with the person who withdraws. It returns to the person who chooses, and choosing is fundamentally different from reacting. When you are reacting, your behavior is shaped by external stimuli. You are responding to what they do, how they feel, how they show up. But when you are choosing, your behavior is anchored internally. It is guided by standards, by self-respect, by clarity about what you will and will not accept. That shift is subtle, but it is powerful because it communicates something without words. My presence is not automatic. It is intentional. And that message lands differently than anything you could say. It forces the avoidant to reconsider their position, not as the one in control of distance, but as someone who now has to meet a new level of consistency if they want access to connection again. And whether they rise to that or not is no longer your responsibility. That's the final piece. You are no longer trying to influence their behavior. You are no longer managing the dynamic. You are simply standing in alignment with yourself. And from that place, everything becomes clearer. Because real power in any connection is not the ability to control another person. It's the ability to remain grounded in who you are, regardless of how they show up. And when you reach that point, the dynamic doesn't just shift, it transforms. The moment you stop reacting is the moment you start leading your own life. And when you arrive at that place where you are no longer reacting, no longer managing the dynamic, no longer abandoning yourself to sustain a connection, you create the only environment where something real can actually change. Not forced change, not temporary adjustment, but true internal transformation. Because here's the truth most people struggle to accept. No one changes because they are persuaded to. No one evolves because they are convinced, pressured, or emotionally negotiated into it. Real change only happens when a person is brought face to face with themselves and decides on their own that they can no longer continue the way they have been. And that moment cannot be manufactured from the outside. It cannot be explained into existence. It has to be encountered. Your silence creates the conditions for that encounter. Without your voice filling the gaps, without your effort stabilizing the connection, without your presence softening the impact of their behavior, the avoidant is left with something they've spent a lifetime avoiding. Direct self-confrontation. Not confrontation in the sense of conflict, but confrontation in the sense of clarity. Seeing themselves without distortion. Recognizing patterns without justification. Feeling the weight of their own decisions without immediate escape. And this is where everything either shifts or it doesn't. Because self-confrontation is the threshold. On one side is the Pravichnyi identity. The version of themselves that relies on distance, control, and emotional detachment to feel safe. On the other side is growth, the willingness to feel more, risk more, and show up in a way that is no longer protected by avoidance. Crossing that threshold requires something most people resist: responsibility without external pressure. No one is asking them to change. No one is demanding a different version of them. No one is negotiating terms, and that's precisely what makes it powerful. Because if they move forward, if they begin to question their patterns, if they choose to show up differently, it is no longer for you. It is because they have recognized internally that their current way of being is no longer sustainable. That awareness is rare, but when it happens, it is lasting. Because change that is chosen is fundamentally different from change that is coerced.